Hello and welcome to another episode of the 16-Bit Thief Podcast. I'm your host, Jake Melvin. Back when I was about 11 years old, my mom enrolled me in a summer program that had me doing stuff at the local bowling alley, skating rink, and water park. Mostly bowled and swam since I never knew how to skate nor did I care to learn. But they all had arcades, which is where I spent 95% of my time at. The skating rink was the prime stand-up because they had a variety of games that were pretty rare and elusive. One of them was Zombie Raid, an incredibly gory and difficult light gun game from Sammy of America. Sammy was always known as more of a publisher, so them being the game's developers was always a neat factor for me. Despite Zombie Raid being fondly remembered, it never got a home port. I always found that kind of unfortunate since I always feel it deserved much more recognition. As par for the course of many of the Japanese devs, many of the workers who worked on this game were hard to contact. I found programmer Hiroaki Murase and contacted him over the history of Zombie Raid and if it ever planned to have a sequel. So without any further ado, let's move on to the interview, shall we? Let's start with question number 1. What led you to join the video game industry and Sammy as a whole? He was hired by Nichibitsu in 1992 to make Game Boy and Mega Drive CD games, but retired in 2 years. After that, he applied for recruitment of American Sammy's research and development startup. Question number 2. We had mentioned in a conversation that you didn't think the Atomiswave was very successful, and in truth, there aren't many of them out in the wild. Why do you think this was the case? His personal impression is that they couldn't make a good game, but the serious fact is that Sammy's first business plan was way too big. Question number 2. We had mentioned in a conversation that you said the Atomiswave was unsuccessful, and in truth, there aren't many of them out in the wild. Why do you think this was the case? His personal impression is that the simple reason was because they couldn't make a good game. But the serious reason is that Sammy's business plan was way too big. Atomiswave's business had two purposes. It came from the fact that the system board is very cheap, and the first purpose was to sell low-priced game machines to markets where system boards of Sega, Taito, and Konami were way too expensive to sell. This was invented because Sammy USA succeeded in selling Walmart stores and bar locations rather than the typical game centers. In this way, the basic plan was to spread cheap system boards around the world, but the means was to capture two different types of markets simultaneously. They weren't able to use their development resources efficiently and divided their investments into smaller pieces. In the end, he ultimately believes they just couldn't make an interesting game. He recalls Dirty Pigskin Football and Sports Shooting USA being good, but they weren't very popular outside of the US. Question number 3. Do you know what kicked off the initial development of Zombie Raid and if the concept ever evolved over time? The first concept is that it was going to be a children's gun game, similar to SNK's Beastbusters, which was also popular with kids, so it might have followed that concept. From the beginning, the concept was that the gun device was fixed and not handheld, mostly for children. There was an intention to sell a version with reduced difficulty as a redemption machine, however. Question number 4. I believe Zombie Raid was a collaboration between the Japanese and American branches of Sammy. What was it like working between the two? Was the language barrier much of an issue? He says that the predecessor of Sammy America was the Taito America branch, and they didn't have a research and development department. They had no developers familiar with the United States market. In order to train such developers, they dispatched developers from Japan. As such, Zombie Raid was created by the Japanese staff, with the exception of the sound development. The president of Sammy America was Japanese, but all the sales teams were American. He thinks that their sales respected the development team's opinions on game development, and in his personal opinion, he believes that the sales team's success later led to the development of Deer Hunting USA. Question number 5. Zombie Raid was unique to me in the fact that it used 2D graphics opposed to the 3D graphics that were gaining traction at the time. What was the choice for this decision? The reason that 3D was not adopted was because they didn't have any 3D processing board or any development knowledge on how to make 3D games. As a result, from the beginning, they decided to opt their own 2D process board for the price competitiveness. Question number 6. One thing that many people remember about Zombie Raid is the immense difficulty that the game has. Were there ever complaints about it during development or location tests? During production, according to Murase, the game difficulty was changed from lower-age teenagers to higher-age teenagers. As such, adjustments towards the difficulty level largely reflected the intentions of the sales team. Question number 7. Zombie Raid is one of the few rail shooters where the best possible ending is obtained via finding items. Where did the idea for the crystal ball come from? According to Murase, the crystal ball idea came from replaying repeatedly as well as increasing coin-op income. At the time, it was normal for games to have such branching routes in order to get to the ending, so they wanted to set themselves apart. Question number 8. While Zombie Raid is still remembered as a gory cult classic, it never received a home port. Were there ever plans to bring it to home consoles or even for a sequel? According to Murase, he says that there were no plans to ever bring Zombie Raid to a home console. While it did gain a good reputation on coin-op markets, it was not considered to be valid in the declining SNES and Genesis era and the rising PlayStation and Saturn markets. They were working on a sequel for coin-op, and it didn't have a similar story but had a similar style. At that time, the reputation of Namco's Point Blank was so good as a gun game, they wanted to make it where it was a detective investigating a suspicious mansion, Point Blank style. Unfortunately, it never came to fruition. Question number 9. Dolphin Blue was created by former Metal Slug staffers including Takushi Hayamuta, Shinichi Hamada, and Kozo in Alias. Despite its relative obscurity and rarity, it's a very fun game. However, it never received a home release. Do you know if there were ever plans to adopt it to home consoles? According to Murase, he said that there were plans for a home version if the game had sold well. However, due to it not selling well, it unfortunately never came to be. Question number 10. The game industry is vastly different in terms of connections that one can make. Do you still keep in contact with the people you worked with at Sammy and Sega? Some developers like Hiroshi Sugino and other Nausicaä staffers have completely disappeared from the public eye. Many people working in the game industry also work for smartphones and consoles. Of course, he also believes that there are many people working in different industries altogether. He still respects his ex-boss Hiroshi Sugino, who now works as a freelance developer after he retired from Sega. He's also working on a Switch game, and the two still work together sometimes. He offered me to check out his blog, which I'll be posting a link to in the description. Question number 11. What is your personal favorite title that you have ever worked on? When he went to a Chinese game show called GTI, he saw a gun device unit from Deer Hunting USA that was used in a shooting game he had never heard of. He loved to see the fact that it was still being used to this day. And so concludes another episode of the 16-Bit Thief podcast. Again, I want to thank Hiroaki Murase for agreeing to do an interview over his time at Sammy and Sega. It's unfortunate that Zombie Raid never received a home port, but hey, at least we have ways to play it online now. That's going to do it for me for this episode, but be sure to check in for the next episode with Steven Reisenberger of Atari, and beyond that, something absolutely massive. I can't wait for you all to hear it. Until then, this is the 16-Bit Thief, signing off.